Lady Elinor Vance had perfected the art of becoming part of the wallpaper. At 24, 2 seasons past her prime and with a dowry as thin as a winter frost, she was a fixture at the edge of every ballroom, a quiet shadow in pale muslin that the vibrant, chattering debutantes swirled past without a glance. She had decided tonight, with a finality that felt like a stone settling in her stomach, that she was done. This would be her last ball. The music, the laughter, the cloying scent of wilting roses and expensive perfume. It was all a language she had never learned to speak. Her mother, a woman whose hopes had faded with each passing season, sat a few chairs down, her fan moving in a rhythm of weary resignation. She no longer prodded Elinor to stand taller or smile brighter. The battle was lost. Soon, Elinor would pack her few presentable gowns and retreat to the countryside, to become a companion to her great-aunt Millicent. A future of pouring tea and reading aloud from tedious sermons stretching before her like a grey, unpaved road. It was not a happy ending, but it was an ending. That was something. She held her glass of lukewarm lemonade, her fingers tight around the condensation. The chatter around her rose and fell, a tide of gossip and flirtation. She heard the name on everyone's lips, a whisper that carried both fear and fascination. Blackwood. The Duke of Blackwood. Alastair Beaumont was a man carved from granite and shadow, the master of a fortune so vast it was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. He was unmarried, powerful, and utterly uninterested in the frivolities of the London season. His presence at any social event was rare enough to cause a stir, but tonight the rumours were particularly frantic. He was here, it was said, for a singular purpose: to choose a wife. Elinor allowed herself a small, bitter smile. The eligible ladies of the ton were practically vibrating with anticipation, their gowns shimmering like the scales of beautiful predatory fish. They preened and posed, each one hoping to be the one chosen to become the Duchess of Blackwood, to tame the untamable Duke. Elinor watched them with the detached curiosity of a naturalist observing a foreign species. She was not part of this hunt. She was merely scenery. Then, the music seemed to falter. A collective breath was drawn, a sudden stillness falling over the glittering ballroom. Elinor looked up from her study of the floor patterns and saw him. He stood in the grand archway, a figure of stark, imposing black against the room's riot of colour. The Duke of Blackwood did not simply enter a room, he commanded it. He was taller than most men, with broad shoulders and a severe, handsome face that promised no warmth. His eyes, the colour of a stormy sea, swept over the assembly with an unnerving lack of expression. He exchanged a few curt words with their host, Lord Ashworth, whose obsequious bowing was almost painful to watch. Then he began to move. He did not dance, he did not mingle. He walked along the perimeter of the ballroom, his gaze analytical, assessing. The line of hopeful mothers and their blushing daughters straightened as he approached, a wave of silent desperation rippling through the room. He passed the beautiful Lady Cressida, whose diamond necklace was said to be worth more than Elinor's family estate, with barely a flicker of interest. He moved past the witty Miss Albright, the charming Lady Beatrice, and dozens of others, his expression unchanging. Elinor's heart began to beat a little faster, a nervous flutter against her ribs. He was getting closer to her quiet corner. She instinctively shrank back, wishing the potted palm beside her were a great oak she could hide behind. Her mother shot her a look, a familiar mix of hope and warning that twisted in Elinor's gut. She wanted to tell her it was pointless, that men like the Duke of Blackwood did not see women like her. They looked right through them. He stopped. He stopped directly in front of her. The entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. The background noise of the ball faded to a distant hum. It was just the two of them, suspended in a bubble of impossible silence. His eyes, so cold from a distance, were startlingly intense up close. They held a depth she could not fathom, a stillness that was more unnerving than any overt emotion. She realized he was waiting for her to speak, to curtsy. Her mind went blank. Her body, however, remembered its training, and she dipped into a passable curtsy, her muslin gown whispering against the polished floor. "Lady Elinor Vance," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and dark like polished mahogany. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, as if he had been studying her name on a ledger. "Your Grace?" she managed to whisper, her throat suddenly tight and dry. He looked from her to her mother, then back to her. There was no smile, no preamble. He was a man who dealt in outcomes, not pleasantries. "Madam," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden profound quiet that had enveloped their corner of the room. "With your permission, I would like to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage." A collective gasp swept through the nearby onlookers. Elinor felt the blood drain from her face. It was a joke. It had to be a cruel, elaborate joke. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery, but there was only that same unnerving, serious intensity. Her mother, for the first time in years, looked utterly speechless, her fan frozen mid-flutter. Elinor's own voice, when it came, was a faint thread of sound. "Why?" The question was out before she could stop it. It was improper, impertinent, and utterly honest. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed the Duke's face. It was not annoyance, but perhaps surprise? "Because I require a duchess," he stated, as if explaining a simple point of logic. "You will suffice." "You will suffice." The words were like a slap, yet they were also strangely clarifying. He wasn't choosing her for her beauty, her wit, or her charm. He was choosing her for her lack of those things. He was choosing her because she was quiet, unassuming, and forgettable. She was a blank slate upon which he could impose the title of Duchess without any inconvenient emotional demands. He had picked her because he thought she would ask nothing of him. Her mother, recovering her senses, quickly stammered an acceptance on Elinor's behalf. The world swam back into focus, a dizzying blur of shocked faces and envious glares. The Duke gave a curt, formal nod. The matter was settled. Just like that, her life, which she had thought was ending, had been irrevocably and terrifyingly altered. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of cold, efficient arrangements. The Duke of Blackwood, it turned out, approached marriage with the same ruthless pragmatism he applied to his business dealings. Lawyers were summoned, settlements were drawn, and a date was set. Elinor saw her fiancé only a handful of times, always in formal, supervised settings. He was polite, distant, and utterly unreadable. He spoke of the running of the Blackwood estate, of the duties she would be expected to perform as Duchess, all with the detached air of a general briefing his new lieutenant. He never asked about her hopes or fears. He never inquired about the books she loved or the quiet walks she cherished. To him, she was a component in a larger machine, a piece that needed to fit neatly into the space he had designated for it. She was Lady Elinor Vance, soon to be the Duchess of Blackwood. The person inside that title was irrelevant. The wedding was a small, sombre affair at the ducal London residence. Elinor wore a gown of heavy cream silk, chosen by the Duke's staff, and felt like a doll being dressed for a play she had not rehearsed. Alistair stood beside her at the altar, a towering, remote figure. He spoke his vows in that same steady baritone, his words clear and precise, holding no more warmth than the stone walls of the chapel. When he slid the heavy gold ring onto her finger, his touch was cool and brief. It was a transaction, finalized. Their journey to Blackwood Manor, the Duke's ancestral seat in the north, was conducted in near silence. Elinor stared out the window of the perfectly sprung carriage, watching the green countryside blur past. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were watching her own life happen to someone else. The man beside her was her husband, yet he was a complete stranger. She knew nothing of his heart, his mind, or his past. She knew only his title and his reputation. Blackwood Manor rose from the rolling hills like a fortress. It was a magnificent Gothic structure of grey stone, with turrets and spires that pierced the bruised purple sky. It was beautiful, imposing, and as cold as its master. Inside, the halls were vast and echoing, filled with dark wood, heavy tapestries, and the portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch her with disapproving eyes. The staff lined up to greet them, their faces impassive, their movements perfectly synchronized. It was a house that ran on order and discipline, not warmth. That night, after a formal, silent dinner, he escorted her to her chambers. They were opulent, decorated in shades of deep blue and silver, with a large canopied bed that felt more like a monument than a place of rest. At the door, he paused. Elinor's heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird. This was it. The consummation of their business arrangement. "These are your rooms," he said, his voice low. "My own are in the west wing. A maid will show you the way should you require anything." He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I will not press you for your duties, not until you are settled. I trust you will find everything you need. Good night, Your Grace." And with that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps receding down the long, silent corridor. Elinor stood frozen in the doorway, a mixture of relief and utter confusion washing over her. He was giving her space. He was treating her with a strange, detached courtesy she hadn't expected. It wasn't kindness, not exactly. It was more like a postponement, a deferral of an unpleasant task. She was a duty he was not yet ready to perform. She closed the door, the heavy wood shutting out the cold, empty hallway, and felt more alone than she ever had in her life. In the days that followed, Elinor began to explore her new prison. Blackwood Manor was less a home than a museum. Every object was perfectly placed, every surface gleamed. But there was no sign of life, of comfort. She felt like a ghost haunting its grand, empty rooms. Her husband was a phantom as well. He was consumed by a state business, spending his days locked in his study or riding out to meet with his tenants. They shared breakfast and dinner, two silent figures at opposite ends of a ridiculously long dining table, the clinking of their silverware the only sound. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive silence, she found the library. It was the only room in the entire manor that felt alive. 2 stories high, with towering shelves packed to the ceiling, it smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over the thousands of books. For the first time since her arrival, Elinor felt a flicker of something other than despair. This was a sanctuary. She ran her fingers over the leather-bound spines, her eyes scanning the titles. There were histories, philosophies, volumes of poetry. And then she saw it, on a lower shelf, almost hidden away. A complete collection of rare botanical texts, the kind she had only ever dreamed of reading. Her father, a quiet scholar, had shared his love of botany with her, but they could never afford such exquisite volumes. "I thought you might find those of interest." She jumped, her hand flying to her chest. The Duke stood in the doorway, watching her. She hadn't heard him approach. He was holding a small, worn book in his hand. "Your Grace," she stammered, feeling like a child caught somewhere she shouldn't be. I did not mean to intrude." "This is your home now, Elinor," he said, his use of her first name startling her. "You may intrude wherever you wish." The library is for use, not for display. He walked towards her, his gaze falling on the botanical books. I had them brought in from the London collection. I was told you had an interest in the subject. Elinor stared at him, bewildered. Told? By whom? Her interest in botany was a private, quiet thing, known only to her immediate family. A flicker of something, was it discomfort, crossed his face before it was smoothed away. One hears things, he said, vaguely. He gestured to the book in his own hand. It was a slim volume of poetry by Keats, one of her favourites. Do you enjoy his work? Very much, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It is full of feeling. He nodded slowly, his eyes on the book, not on her. Indeed. He seemed about to say more, but then he straightened, the mask of the cold, efficient Duke falling back into place. I will leave you to your reading. He set the volume of Keats on a nearby table and left as silently as he had arrived. Elinor stood among the books, her mind reeling. How did he know about her love for botany? Why was he reading Keats? It was a crack in the granite facade, a small, confusing glimpse of something she did not understand. He had chosen her because she was supposed to be simple, unremarkable, a convenient duchess who would ask nothing of him. But that small, thoughtful gesture, the acquisition of those rare books, was anything but simple. It was personal. It was a contradiction that began to plant a tiny, unsettling seed of curiosity in the barren soil of her resignation. Their first public appearance as Duke and Duchess was a grand ball held by a neighbouring earl. Elinor dreaded it. She knew what they would see, the cold, ruthless Duke and his plain, mouse-like bride. She could already hear the whispers, feel the pitying or scornful glances. Alastair seemed to sense her apprehension. As they prepared to leave, he paused in the grand foyer. You look appropriate, he said, his gaze clinical as it swept over her gown of deep sapphire silk. It was hardly a compliment, but from him it was something. He extended his arm. They will stare. Let them. The ballroom was as glittering and loud as any in London. As they were announced, a hush fell, followed by a wave of murmurs. Elinor kept her head high, her hand resting lightly on her husband's arm. His presence was a formidable shield. No one would dare be openly rude to the Duchess of Blackwood while the Duke stood beside her. But society had its weapons, and Lady Cressida Thorne was an expert in wielding them. She had been widely considered the most likely candidate for the position Elinor now held, and her fury at being passed over was legendary. She approached them with a smile as sharp and bright as broken glass. Your Grace, she cooed, dipping into a flawless curtsy before Alastair. Then she turned her venomous gaze on Elinor. And the new Duchess, how charming. I must say, Blackwood, you have surprised us all. I never took you for a man with such domestic tastes. One might almost think you picked your bride from the shadows simply to ensure she would never outshine you. The insult was delivered with a sweet smile, but it landed like a physical blow. Elinor felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She could feel the eyes of everyone around them, watching, waiting for her reaction. She opened her mouth to offer some sort of dignified, if weak, reply, but she never got the chance. Alastair, who had been standing impassively, moved with startling speed. He stepped slightly in front of Elinor, a subtle but unmistakable protective gesture. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was so cold it seemed to drop the temperature of the air around them. Lady Cressida, he said, his tone like chipping ice. My wife's brilliance is of a kind you would never be equipped to recognize. It is quiet, it is genuine, and it is not for sale to the highest bidder. He leaned in slightly, his eyes boring into hers. You will address the Duchess with the respect her station demands, or you will not address her at all. Is that understood? Lady Cressida's face went white. The crowd around them was utterly silent, stunned. To be so thoroughly and publicly rebuked by the Duke of Blackwood was a social death sentence. She stammered something incoherent and practically fled, her friends scattering in her wake. Alistair turned back to Elinor. The cold fury in his eyes had vanished, replaced by that familiar, unreadable mask. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice back to its usual low, even tone. Elinor could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She was shaking. It wasn't just the shock of the confrontation, it was the shock of his defense. He had defended her. Not her title, not her station, but her. My wife's brilliance. The words echoed in her mind, nonsensical and yet thrilling. Why would he do that? Why would he care enough to humiliate one of the most powerful women in the county for her sake? It made no sense. This was not the act of a man who had chosen a bride for mere convenience. This was something else entirely. And for the first time, Elinor realized she had to know what it was. The carriage ride home was thick with unspoken words. Elinor sat opposite her husband, studying his profile in the flickering lamplight. The hard lines of his jaw, the severe set of his mouth. He was the same man who had stood beside her at the altar, a cold and distant stranger. And yet, he was not. Something had shifted. The man who had defended her with such quiet ferocity was not the same man who had declared her merely sufficient. Back at the Manor, the staff melted away, leaving them alone in the vast, echoing entrance hall. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, marking the seconds of a silence that felt heavier than stone. Elinor knew that if she let this moment pass, if she went up to her solitary chambers, as she always did, she might never have the courage to ask again. The fragile thread of connection that had sparked between them tonight would snap. He turned to go, as she expected him to. "Good night, Elinor." "Alistair, wait," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. He stopped, his back to her, and slowly turned around. He looked surprised that she had used his name, that she had commanded him to stop. She took a breath, her heart hammering. "Tonight, thank you for what you said to Lady Cressida." He gave a slight, dismissive nod. "It was nothing. She was insulting my Duchess. It was a matter of honor." "No," Elinor insisted, taking a step closer. "It was more than that. You spoke of my brilliance. A quality I am quite certain no one else has ever accused me of possessing. You said I would suffice, Your Grace. You said you chose me because you required a duchess. That was the arrangement." Her voice trembled slightly, but she pushed on. "But your actions do not match your words. The books in the library, what you did tonight. None of it aligns with a marriage of mere convenience. I have to know the truth. Why did you really choose me?" He stood perfectly still, his face a mask of stone in the dim light. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer, that he would retreat behind his walls of ducal authority and leave her with her questions unanswered. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Then he let out a long, slow breath, a sound of such profound weariness it seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of uncertainty so at odds with his usual composure that it stunned her. He looked lost. "You are right," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual authority. "It was not a marriage of convenience. Not for me." He finally met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw not the cold Duke, but a man who looked vulnerable and perhaps even a little afraid. "The truth, Elinor, is that I have been in love with you for 5 years. The words fell into the cavernous hall like stones into a frozen pond, shattering the silence and her entire perception of reality. Elinor could only stare at him, her mind unable to process what she had just heard. In love with her? The invisible, plain Elinor Vance? It was impossible. A fantasy. "That cannot be," she whispered. "You don't even know me. We had never spoken before the night of the ball." "I know," he said, a pained look crossing his features. "That is my shame, not yours." He gestured to a pair of chairs near the unlit fireplace. "Please, sit. You deserve an explanation." She moved numbly, sinking into the plush velvet of the chair as he began to speak. His voice was low, hesitant, as if he were unearthing a story that had been buried for a very long time. "It was at a garden party at the Marquis of Pemberton's estate," he began, "5 years ago. It was my first season after inheriting the title. I hated it. I hated the fawning, the false smiles, the endless parade of mothers pushing their daughters at me as if I were a prize stallion." He paused, his gaze distant. "I was trying to escape, and I wandered into a small, secluded rose garden, and I saw you." He looked at her then, and his eyes held a memory so vivid she felt as if she could see it herself. "You were not with the others. You were sitting on a stone bench under a willow tree, away from the noise. You had a book of poetry in your lap, but you weren't reading. You were sketching the petals of a white rose in a small notebook. You were so completely absorbed, so peaceful. The world and all its clamor might not have existed." Eleanor's breath caught. She remembered that day. She remembered the book. It had been Keats. She had been trying to capture the delicate curl of the rose petals, a futile but calming exercise. She had felt so utterly alone, but also, for a moment, perfectly content in her solitude. She had no idea anyone had been watching. "I stood there for I don't know how long," Alistair continued, his voice laced with self-reproach. "I should have approached you. I should have introduced myself, asked about your drawing, about the book. But I couldn't. I was a coward." He scoffed, a bitter sound. The ruthless Duke of Blackwood, terrified of speaking to a quiet girl in a garden. I had already been cast in my role. I was cold, arrogant, unapproachable. I didn't know how to be anything else. And I was certain that if I approached you, you would see me as everyone else did, and you would be repulsed. "So I did nothing," he confessed, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. "I watched you from afar. For 5 years. I went to social events I despised just on the chance I might see you. I learned your name. I learned of your family's financial troubles. I saw how society overlooked you, how they dismissed you. And it made me furious. Because they were all blind. They saw a plain girl in a simple dress. I saw an intelligent, graceful woman with a soul so rich and quiet they couldn't even begin to comprehend it." He fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air between them. Eleanor's mind was a maelstrom of emotions, shock, disbelief, but also a strange, burgeoning sense of wonder. Her entire life she had felt unseen, but he had seen her. All along, the one person she would have thought least likely to notice her had been watching her with a secret, impossible devotion. "The years passed," he went on, his voice rough with emotion. "I knew I had to secure the succession, that I had to marry. The thought of marrying any of those other women, the Cressidas of the world, was intolerable. And I saw you, getting ready to retreat from the world entirely. I knew I was running out of time. So I devised that monstrous plan, to propose at the ball. I knew it was crude. I knew it was unfair to you," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "But it was the only way I could think of. I couldn't court you. I didn't know how. I thought if I offered you a real courtship, you would refuse. You would see me only as the cold duke. So I created a situation where you couldn't say no. A business proposition. I offered you a title and security, thinking it was all I had that you might want. I told you that you would suffice, because I was terrified of telling you the truth, that you were the only woman I had ever wanted. He finally looked up, his eyes pleading, stripped bare of all artifice. The coldness, Elinor. The distance. It has all been a lie. A shield. I filled the library with books I hoped you would love. I have kept my distance because I feel I have no right to your affection, having trapped you in this way. I married you under false pretenses, and I am so sorry. Elinor sat in stunned silence, the truth of his words washing over her. The puzzle pieces of the last few weeks clicked into place. His strange knowledge of her, his unexpected defense, his deferral of their wedding night. It wasn't cold indifference. It was fear. It was reverence. He hadn't seen her as forgettable. He had seen her as so unforgettable that he had orchestrated this entire charade just to bring her into his life. She thought of her own lonely years, of feeling like a ghost at the feast. And she realized, with a jolt that went straight to her core, that he had been just as lonely. He was a prisoner of his own title, his own reputation, just as she had been a prisoner of her circumstances. Two lonely people, hiding in plain sight of one another. Slowly, she rose from her chair and walked towards him. He watched her approach, his expression uncertain, braced for rejection. She stopped in front of him and gently reached out, her fingers touching his clenched fist. At her touch, his hand uncurled, and he laced his fingers with hers. His skin was warm, real. "You were wrong about one thing, Alistair," she said softly, her voice clear and steady. "Only one?" he asked, a ghost of a wry smile touching his lips. "You thought all you had to offer was a title and security," she clarified. "But you were wrong. You offered me a sanctuary in your library. You offered me your protection in a room full of enemies. You showed me a glimpse of the man behind the Duke, and I find myself very much wanting to know that man." A look of profound, heart-stopping relief flooded his face. The tension seemed to drain out of him, leaving behind a raw, trembling vulnerability. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Elinor." He breathed her name like a prayer. "I have made a mess of this, of us. But if you would allow me, I would like to begin again, properly. May I court my own wife?" A genuine smile, the first she had felt in years, spread across her face. It felt like the sun breaking through a long winter's clouds. "I think, Your Grace," she said, her eyes shining, "that I would like that very much." In that moment, standing in the cold, grand hall of Blackwood Manor, with her hand in his, nothing else mattered. The whispers of society, the years of loneliness, the pain of being overlooked, it all faded away. There was only the truth, finally spoken, and the quiet, miraculous promise of a new beginning. 1 year later, the sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Blackwood Manor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The house was no longer silent. The heavy tapestries had been replaced with lighter, brighter ones, and vases of fresh flowers from the garden stood on every table. The stern-faced ancestors still watched from their portraits, but now their expressions seemed less disapproving, more tolerant. The sound of laughter, a sound the old manor had not heard in generations, often echoed through its halls. Elinor, Duchess of Blackwood, sat on a familiar stone bench under the willow tree in the secluded rose garden. The garden was her personal project, now overflowing with vibrant, fragrant blooms. She held a small, sleeping bundle in her arms, her infant son, Thomas, his dark hair a soft echo of his father's. She was no longer the invisible girl who hid in the shadows. She was a woman who had found her voice, her confidence, her place. Being the Duchess had given her a platform, but it was Alistair's love that had given her the strength to stand on it. She was an active partner in the management of the estate, her keen mind and quiet observations proving invaluable. The tenants, initially wary of their new Duchess, had come to adore her for her genuine kindness and compassion. Footsteps on the gravel path made her look up. Alistair was walking towards her, his severe coat shed in favour of simple shirt sleeves. The cold, impenetrable mask of the Duke was gone, replaced by the warm, open expression of a man at peace. He smiled as he approached, a real, easy smile that reached his sea-storm eyes and softened them to the colour of a calm summer sky. "There you are," he said softly, sitting beside her on the bench. He leaned over and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, then to the downy head of their son. "Hiding from your duties?" "I am performing my most important duty," she replied, her own smile matching his. "Teaching our heir to appreciate the simple beauty of a rose." He chuckled, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her close. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the breeze rustle the leaves of the willow tree. It was here, in this very spot, that he had first seen her. It had become their sanctuary, a place of quiet pilgrimage for two souls who had found each other against all odds. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked, his voice low. "The ball where I ambushed you?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "I think of the terrified girl I was, so sure her life was over. I think of the formidable Duke who seemed to have the world at his feet." "I had no idea we were both just as lost as the other." "I was more lost than you," he corrected gently. "You were merely waiting. I was actively running in the wrong direction." He looked at her, his expression filled with a love so profound it still sometimes took her breath away. "Thank you, Elinor, for seeing past the fool I was, for giving me a chance to be the man I always wanted to be, but never knew how." "You were always that man, Alistair," she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You were just very good at hiding him." He had chosen her, he once thought, because she would ask nothing of him. He could not have been more wrong. She had asked for everything: his honesty, his vulnerability, his heart. And in giving her everything, he had found his own salvation. His world had not been built on assumptions. It had been a fortress built on fear. And she, his quiet, forgettable bride, had been the only one with the key to its gate. The world still saw the powerful Duke of Blackwood and his elegant Duchess. But here, in the quiet of their garden, they were just Alistair and Elinor. A man and a woman who had discovered that a person's true worth is not measured by the crowd's applause, but by the quiet, steady gaze of the one who takes the time to truly see. Love, they had learned, could be patient and silent, and it was never, ever too late to begin again.